Thanks for tuning in at Brackies.
Hello everyone and welcome to this video on making a multiplayer FPS in Unity. Today we are going to be adding some cool particle systems to our game. So in this video we are going to be adding both a death explosion effect and a respawn particle effect. We're also going to be changing between the scene and the player camera, so it will look super cool when we die. We can see the entire map and stuff like that. So that's going to look super awesome and be a lot of fun. So without further ado, let's just jump right into today's video here, and you can see that I'm here in Unity. And the first thing that I want to take a look at is just how it looks right now when we play the game. So if I go under our player and double click our player script here, and I'm just going to say yes to all of this. There we go, and just remove those two. You can see here that we have a piece of code that we've written in an earlier video that is commented, and I'm just going to uncomment this, and you can just write it back in, just copy it here if you haven't have deleted this for some reason. And this is simply for testing the respawn mechanic. We simply say that if we press the key K for a kill, we add a bunch of damage to our player. So this will just allow us to kill ourselves here, commit suicide, and when we do, we can see what happens. So if I hit play now and go into land host and hit K, you can see that I become unable to move, but there's no kind of visual feedback for what's going on. And if we have a look in the scene view, what happens is basically we just freeze in place, and the physics are actually still applied, and nothing really happens. So the first thing that we could take a look at doing here is maybe adding in some particles, more specifically an explosion effect. So if we go under standard assets, particle systems, and then prefabs, and again, in order to import this, we simply right click, go import package, and then particle systems if you don't have this folder. Then we can take the explosion prefab here and drag that in. This is going to act as a base for our cool explosion effect. And you will see in a moment what this looks like. So if we just drag this up a bit from the ground, just to add a Y of 1, let's try that. And try and hit play, you will see that this explosion is huge. It looks super cool, but it's also very large. And therefore, Unity has provided this cool particle system multiplier. So if we set this to something like 0.4, it should scale the particle system down. And it does, however, the smoke surrounding it still looks super weird. So let's try and configure this a bit. In order to have the smoke black not be affected by this particle system multiplier, we'll create a sub object. So simply create an empty object here and reset the transform when it's parented under the explosion. And let's just call this something like particles. It doesn't really matter. Let's take all of the objects here except the smoke black and move them under there. And then we're going to break the prefab instance, but that's fine with me because we're going to be turning this into a separate prefab in a second anyways. Then we can take our particle system multiplier and multiplier and then copy that component and remove it, and then paste it as new on the particles object. We can do the same with the explosion physics force. You can also just go ahead and simply delete that component if you want to. This is simply going to add an explosion force, so any rigid body objects nearby will be affected by the explosion. We're just going to keep this in for now, and then we might change it later. So then we have this smoke black here, and this is what we want to change. And first off, we could maybe set the duration a bit shorter, something like 0.5. And let's just center in on this. We could also take the shape here because it's currently huge and set that to a radius of 1. And let's try this again. It's already much better. We can then maybe change the lifetime, actually the duration here. I wanted that to be, 0.5 is going to be fine. And then the lifetime, we can set that to something like, I don't know, between 0.7 and 1.2. Let's try and simulate that. That looks much better. Let's actually do 1 here. I like 1.2 better. And the start size here, let's set that between 75 and 150 maybe. Maybe 130 is better. So let's try and simulate that. And that looks much better. So it's now a much less dramatic effect, and it should look much cooler. We can also go into the emission here and change the rate to something like 8 just to thin up the smoke a bit. And I think that looks super cool. So we're just going to stick with that. And we can now take this and make it into a new prefab. So let's go under our prefabs folder and drag the explosion in there. Good. So we are now ready to code the instantiation of this explosion. So let's select our player and go to our player script, double click that again. And let's first off set up a quick reference to that explosion object. So let's do a serialized field private game object. And this is going to be the death effect. And all we want to do is find the place where we die. Remember, we have this RPC, client RPC called take damage. And if, of course, because this is a client RPC, it means that it is called on all of the different clients whenever a game object takes damage. And therefore, the die method here is called inside of this will also be executed on all of the clients. So that's perfect for spawning in temporary effects because it's going to spawn on each separate clients, and it's not going to be handled over the network in any way. It's going to be spawned actually locally on the client. So that's just fine. And what we can do here is maybe just quickly add in some comments. So what we do here is we disable components that we don't want. Here we disable the collider. And here we spawn a death effect. And we simply do this by using the instantiate method. And what we want to spawn is the, we call it death effect. And we want to spawn this at our current position, so transform.position, and the rotation really doesn't matter. So we are just going to use quaternion.identity, and so we get a 0, 0, 0 rotation. And let's just store a quick reference to this so we can delete it after a couple of seconds so it won't clutter up the hierarchy. So we'll make a temporary game object here called, let's just say graphics, GFX instance, and set that equal to the instantiated object, and we need to cast that to the type game object. And then down here we can simply say that we want to destroy this graphics instance after, let's say, 3 seconds. This way we could give the smoke plenty of time to dissolve. Good. And all we need to do now is simply wait for this slot here to appear. And then let's just lock this inspector, go under our prefabs folder and drag the explosion into the death effect slot. And we can now unlock that again. And let's hit play and see if this is actually working. So we can take our scene view and just dock it over there. So we can see what's going on in the scene here. And we can spawn in. And we can move over here and then press K, and you can see that a cool explosion now spawns. And I think that looks super nice. So what we need to do now is actually disable the player graphics. So you can see currently under our player, we have this disable on death array. And this will disable a certain, the components added to this array when we die. And what we could do is we could go through all of the different renderers associated with our graphics under the different graphics objects and add them in here. But that would be tedious, and yeah, we don't want to do that. So what we do instead is we go up here and then we create a new array, and this array is going to disable objects, entire game objects instead. And this is going to be the disable game objects on death. And what we simply want to do here is first off, up here in the setup, we don't need to do that. We also do it here. So we can simply copy this for loop, and here we want to disable game objects instead of just components. And we can change this to disable game objects on death and do the same here. And instead of using .enable and setting that to a boolean, we use .setActive, and then we put in false right here. So then we just disable all of that. And we can just take this entire for loop and duplicate it for down here. So here we want to then set all of them to true again. We want to enable them again. So here we set components active, and here we also enable the game objects. That's a better way to put it here. So enable the components. There we go. And for the components, we remembered whether or not they were enabled before and then set them back to that state. For the game objects here, we're just enabling them again. That's going to be fine for now. If we run into some problems later, we are going to change that, of course. So here we want to enable the collider as well. There we go. And that's going to work just fine. And I think we are already ready to add some game objects that we wanted to disable. And the first one that comes to mind is the entire graphics object. So we can just add that to the array. And this doesn't include the weapon, but you will see that our game object disappears here. So when I press K, the guy disappears, and that looks already much better. However, I want to also disable the weapon, and the weapon sits under the camera object, and that's fine because I want to also disable the camera. However, when we disable the camera, I want to make sure that our scene camera gets enabled instead. So if we were to go ahead and drag the entire camera object in here, that's going to disable the camera, the weapon holder, and all of the stuff under that, all of the weapons. And that's going to be fine. However, it's going to say that the scene is missing a full screen camera, and that's because our scene camera here is still disabled. So let's create a way through script for us to enable that and control its current state. And I think the way that we are going to do that is currently, if we take a look at our player setup script, we're simply finding our main camera and setting that to active or not active. And that's fine as long as we only have a very limited amount of cameras and we always control that the scene camera is tagged as the main camera. And it's okay. However, I think a better way for this for us to do this would have the game manager to control the state of the scene camera. It will have a reference to what camera is the scene camera, and it will have a method that will enable and disable it. So that's what we are going to do. And therefore, we're simply going to delete all of this. We're going to delete the scene camera reference up here. And we're going to change the code down here. What I basically want to do is have some kind of method on the game manager. So we can say game manager.instance, and then we can call some kind of method here. Let's go ahead and create that method now. So if we jump over to our game manager, open that up, and make a reference to our scene camera. So just put a slot here, a private, and this is just going to be a game object because I want to disable the entire game object so we don't have multiple audio listeners, and so we disable the flare and the GUI layer and stuff like that. So a private game object, and this is just going to store the scene camera. And then what we can do down here is we can make a public void called maybe set scene camera active state, whatever, set scene camera active. And then we have a boolean here called is active that will control whether or not it's currently enabled. And then what we do is, first off, we want to check if the scene camera is equal to null. Well, then we want to not do anything inside of this method and simply just return. We simply want to just quit out of that method. And if it is not equal to null, meaning that it's equal to something, well, then we want to say scene camera.setActive, and then we want to pass in the isActive variable that we have passed in over here. Good. And remember to do this check because we are calling this from the onDisable method, and therefore it might be equal to null. That is something that happens. So unless you want to have error messages, it's a good idea to do that check. Then we can now just, on the instance here, find the method called set scene camera active, and we can set that to true. When we are not no longer in the scene, we want to just set the or no longer active as a player when we are destroyed, then we want to set that scene camera to active. At another point, we might be transitioning to some kind of menu scene, but this is what we're doing for now. Then under our player object, we can call the exact same method, and that is the cool part. So now in here, under the die method here, we can check that if we are the local player, if is local player, and again, we only want to execute this for the local player because whenever a player dies, it's only his camera that should change. It would be weird if you killed someone and then you were taking to the scene camera. That doesn't make sense. We only want it for the guy that is actually killed. And here we switch camera, and we simply do game manager .instance.set scene camera active to true. Yeah, there we go. So we want to set that true, and we can copy this line of code, go down to the set defaults, and here again we want to copy the if statement also. So there we go, and now we want to set it to false because when we are spawned in and we call the set defaults, we want the scene camera active to be false as well. Good, so we save that, and let's try and hit play here, and let's select our LAN host, and something is not working, and I bet that is because we didn't get an error, but we did not either reference a scene camera, and that's something you need to do. So let's do that, and now hit play and select LAN host here. You can see the scene camera gets disabled. If we now kill off this guy, you can see it switches to the scene camera and it switches back on. However, you will also notice that it doesn't turn off the in-game UI. So if I press K here, it's there and it's frozen, but it's there. So we want to disable that temporarily. And a very simple way to do this, is if we look under the player setup script, we already have a reference to our current player UI, the player UI instance. It's up here. So if we just went ahead and made this public, and we don't want to be able to see this in the Unity inspector, so we'll tag this as a hide in inspector so we don't see it, but we do want to be able to access it. What we can then do is we can go under our player script. First off, we want to make sure that we have a player's setup on the same object, so we don't get any null references here. So we want to require component type of player setup. This way we don't have to do any error checking. And then inside of our isLocalPlayer here, when we set the scene camera state, we can also say get component of the type player setup dot set active. Oops. And it's called player something with player UI instance dot set active, and then we can set that to false. So whenever we enable the camera, we disable the player UI, and we of course want to invert that down there. Good. So now when we don't need to reference anything, so now when we hit play, select LAN host and kill this guy, you can see that the UI disappears, and that it will be that way with any kind of in-game UI we create under this object. So also the crosshair disappears and everything is just perfect. Good. So the next thing that I kind of wanted to take a look at here, if we see everything's working with that, and we have our player here and the death effect. The final thing I wanted to take a look at is a cool respawn prefab. So let's go ahead and actually create this in the game. So first off, let's go under standard assets, particle systems, prefabs. Again, you can import this if it's not there. And I want to base my effect off of the fireworks effect. I think this is a super cool effect. However, I don't want all of these trails and the smoke. I only want the explosion sub-emitter. And we're going to break the prefab instance. That's fine. And we can delete the rest of the particle system. And I want to rename this to something like spawn effect. And my phone is going off here. Excuse me for a second. I'm just going to turn that off very quickly. And hopefully we can continue with the video here. Cool. So we can call this the spawn effect, and we can maybe just move this up 1 unit. And if we zoom in on this, you can see just how cool this effect actually is. And what I want to do is I want to turn off looping on this. I want to change the duration to something like 1, and I want to change the lifetime to, let's say, somewhere between 0.5 and 1 maybe. There we go. So that just brought the effect down a bit, but I still think it has this very cool, bright and colorful feel to it, which is definitely nice to have in the game. So yeah, I am really satisfied with that. And you can of course tweak this to death. You can do anything you want with that. I'm just going to now drag this under the prefabs folder, turn it into a prefab. And let's just very quickly do the code that will spawn this in. So under our player objects, we will go up here, scroll. It's becoming quite the script, this one. And let's just duplicate that. Instead of a death effect, we now want a spawn effect. And we don't want to spawn this in when we die, of course. Instead, we want to spawn this in. A good place to do it would be under the respawn method. However, our respawn method is only called when we have died, not when we first enter the game. However, our set defaults method is called also when we enter the game. So I want to put the code in there. However, I also want to move this set defaults method down after we set our current position, because this way we won't spawn in the particles at the place where we died. Instead, we will spawn them in at our new spawn location, and things won't look weird. So that's quite an important step. And then we can go under our set defaults here, and we can just make a new comment here called create spawn effect. And it's going to do the exact same as when we were spawning a death effect up here. So let's just copy that part of the code, change the name here to spawn effect, and everything else should work just fine. So now when we save that, head back into Unity, we should have a field there that we can now populate, and we want to log that, go under our prefabs, go under our spawn effect, and drag that in there. And now we should hopefully see this working. So when I select land host, you can see that we have this cool respawn effect, and I can go ahead and destroy my player, and it's going to spawn there with the cool looking effect. And I'm just going to demonstrate that this is working over the network. So let's go ahead and hit Control B or Command B if you're on the Mac to make a standalone build that we can test this on. And it is going to work in almost every way except one that I will show you. And that's not something we're going to be fixing today, and I will explain why. So let's go ahead and hit play here. Select host over here, and that is working. Then select client here, and you can see here that was the part that wasn't working. When we join as a client, it spawns for both the current your own player, but also on all of the other players that are currently active. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let me just show you that if I kill this guy, he explodes and he spawns back in beautifully. And it's the same if I do this for the other one. However, I'm not going to show you that right now because, well, then you can't see that. But you can see here it works just fine on this system as well as this one. So that's super cool. So as soon as the objects are actually in the game, everything works fine. The only issue is when you spawn in as a client. And I can show you this again. If I press client here now, whoops. Okay, so we have some weird functionality going on here. Maybe things didn't work quite as well as we wanted them to. So if I kill myself here, that looks just fine. Oh, and this was also a result of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, of course. So the reason why we have this weird functionality is because we have of the way we have set up our player script. So if we go under our player here, we can see that we have this setup method. And this setup method is super nice because it sets our object up just as we want it to be set up. The problem is not with this method. The problem is with how it's called. Because currently, this setup method is called for all of the different clients. And that means that on all of the different players as well. And that means that if I am a player and I want to join a lobby, and this lobby currently has 4 players in it, and I'm the 5th player. Well, then when I join that lobby, I only want to call this setup method that sets all of the defaults values and stuff like that and creates a spawn prefab. I only want that to be called on this player. I want it to be called on all the clients because I want all of them to spawn in the cool prefabs and update the fact that or update this object, but I don't want it to be called for all of the different objects, because this way all of the players will be reset when just a single player spawns. And that's the current way we have it set up. And that of course doesn't work, because if we look under our set defaults method, we are, for example, resetting the health of this guy. We're also spawning in some particle systems and stuff like that. And that means that when we spawn in any kind of player, he will make sure that all of the other players' health is reset. And that's not something we want. That is unfortunately not something we're going to be changing in this video, because it requires some restructuring of how we have this, of how we call this method. You can see currently we just call it in the start method. And frankly, I think this is going to be a lot easier to do when we actually create some kind of network manager on our own. And this way we can call these kind of setup methods through that and have way more control. So we're going to have to leave this for now, because this video is already very long. Just know that I am aware of this bug and that I definitely want to fix that in a upcoming video. So I will look into it for sure. So with that said, that was the particle systems here, and I hope you enjoyed it. I think particle systems are one of the most fun parts of using Unity. Yeah, so that was it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.